I am really very proud of the efforts that we are making, and all the bank is highly committed and motivated to make this a reality.
FinFund is a development financier and impact investor with the mission to build a better world by investing in sustainable and viable businesses in developing countries. With annual investments totaling over 250 million euros in Africa and across Asia and Latin America, we provide equity, long-term investment loans and mezzanine financing. Profitable and responsible businesses are vital to development. They provide employment and enable people to earn a living and rise from poverty. And they have an important role to play in tackling climate change. Many of our projects help create new ways for consumers to access energy supply and services. But the way in which developing countries meet their rapidly growing energy needs will be critical to curbing climate change. Renewable energy is one of FinFund's focus areas. We invest in companies which generate cleaner, cheaper, and more reliable energy than existing alternatives, including wind, solar, hydro, and bioenergy, as well as geothermal, C&I solutions, and e-mobility. Energy is a key sector for FinFund, covering 1/4 of our total portfolio, and for which we have a dedicated investment team. Especially renewable energy contributes not only to development goals, but also to international targets on climate change mitigation and adaptation. FinFund, professional impact investing in developing countries.
I am really very proud of the efforts that we are making, and all the bank is highly committed and motivated to make this a reality.
FinFund is a development financier and impact investor with the mission to build a better world by investing in sustainable and viable businesses in developing countries. With annual investments totaling over 250 million euros in Africa and across Asia and Latin America, we provide equity, long-term investment loans and mezzanine financing. Profitable and responsible businesses are vital to development. They provide employment and enable people to earn a living and rise from poverty. And they have an important role to play in tackling climate change. Many of our projects help create new ways for consumers to access energy supply and services. But the way in which developing countries meet their rapidly growing energy needs will be critical to curbing climate change. Renewable energy is one of FinFund's focus areas. We invest in companies which generate cleaner, cheaper and more reliable energy than existing alternatives, including wind, solar, hydro and bioenergy, as well as geothermal, C&I solutions and e-mobility. Energy is a key sector for FinFund, covering 1/4 of our total portfolio, and for which we have a dedicated investment team. Especially renewable energy contributes not only to development goals, but also to international targets on climate change mitigation and adaptation. FinFund, professional impact investing in developing countries.
I am really very proud of the efforts that we are making, and all the bank is highly committed and motivated to make this a reality.
FinFund is a development financier and impact investor with the mission to build a better world by investing in sustainable and viable businesses in developing countries. With annual investments totaling over 250 million euros in Africa and across Asia and Latin America, we provide equity, long-term investment loans and mezzanine financing. Profitable and responsible businesses are vital to development. They provide employment and enable people to earn a living and rise from poverty. And they have an important role to play in tackling climate change. Many of our projects help create new ways for consumers to access energy supply and services. But the way in which developing countries meet their rapidly growing energy needs will be critical to curbing climate change. Renewable energy is one of FinFund's focus areas. We invest in companies which generate cleaner, cheaper and more reliable energy than existing alternatives, including wind, solar, hydro and bioenergy, as well as geothermal, C&I solutions and e-mobility. Energy is a key sector for FinFund, covering 1/4 of our total portfolio, and for which we have a dedicated investment team. Especially renewable energy contributes not only to development goals, but also to international targets on climate change mitigation and adaptation. FinFund, professional impact investing in developing countries.
I am really very proud of the efforts that we are making, and all the bank is highly committed and motivated to make this a reality.
FinFund is a development financier and impact investor with the mission to build a better world by investing in sustainable and viable businesses in developing countries. With annual investments totaling over 250 million euros in Africa and across Asia and Latin America, we provide equity, long-term investment loans and mezzanine financing. Profitable and responsible businesses are vital to development. They provide employment and enable people to earn a living and rise from poverty. And they have an important role to play in tackling climate change. Many of our projects help create new ways for consumers to access energy supply and services. But the way in which developing countries meet their rapidly growing energy needs will be critical to curbing climate change. Renewable energy is one of FinFund's focus areas. We invest in companies which generate cleaner, cheaper and more reliable energy than existing alternatives, including wind, solar, hydro and bioenergy, as well as geothermal, C&I solutions and e-mobility. Energy is a key sector for FinFund, covering 1/4 of our total portfolio, and for which we have a dedicated investment team. Especially renewable energy contributes not only to development goals, but also to international targets on climate change mitigation and adaptation. FinFund, professional impact investing in developing countries.
I am really very proud of the efforts that we are making, and all the bank is highly committed and motivated to make this a reality.
FinFund is a development financier and impact investor with the mission to build a better world by investing in sustainable and viable businesses in developing countries. With annual investments totaling over 250 million euros in Africa and across Asia and Latin America, we provide equity, long-term investment loans and mezzanine financing. Profitable and responsible businesses are vital to development. They provide employment and enable people to earn a living and rise from poverty. And they have an important role to play in tackling climate change. Many of our projects help create new ways for consumers to access energy supply and services. But the way in which developing countries meet their rapidly growing energy needs will be critical to curbing climate change. Renewable energy is one of FinFund's focus areas. We invest in companies which generate cleaner, cheaper and more reliable energy than existing alternatives, including wind, solar, hydro and bioenergy, as well as geothermal, CNI solutions and e-mobility. Energy is a key sector for FinFund, covering 1/4 of our total portfolio, and for which we have a dedicated investment team. Especially renewable energy contributes not only to development goals, but also to international targets on climate change mitigation and adaptation. FinFund, professional impact investing in developing countries.
I am really very proud of the efforts that we are making, and all the bank is highly committed and motivated to make this a reality.
FinFund is a development financier and impact investor with the mission to build a better world by investing in sustainable and viable businesses in developing countries. With annual investments totaling over 250 million euros in Africa and across Asia and Latin America, we provide equity, long-term investment loans and mezzanine financing. Profitable and responsible businesses are vital to development. They provide employment and enable people to earn a living and rise from poverty. And they have an important role to play in tackling climate change. Many of our projects help create new ways for consumers to access energy supply and services. But the way in which developing countries meet their rapidly growing energy needs will be critical to curbing climate change. Renewable energy is one of FinFund's focus areas. We invest in companies which generate cleaner, cheaper and more reliable energy than existing alternatives, including wind, solar, hydro and bioenergy, as well as geothermal, C&I solutions and e-mobility. Energy is a key sector for FinFund, covering 1/4 of our total portfolio, and for which we have a dedicated investment team. Especially renewable energy contributes not only to development goals, but also to international targets on climate change mitigation and adaptation. FinFund, professional impact investing in developing countries.
I am really very proud of the efforts that we are making, and all the bank is highly committed and motivated to make this a reality.
Moi, c'est Xavier Curtis, plus connu sous le sobriquet de Phoenix. Je suis artiste, peintre, dessinateur, graffeur. J'évolue présentement à Conakry, là où je suis né et j'ai grandi. La structure se nomme 21 Art Nation et elle a pour but présentement de faire en sorte que les artistes puissent vivre de leur art et que l'art et plus particulièrement la peinture soit bien promu en Guinée. Bon, le manque d'énergie, on va dire que ça affecte assez négativement parce que, comme vous le voyez, vous pouvez le voir derrière moi, nous travaillons au niveau des arts visuels. Dans le visuel, il y a les yeux. Donc s'il n'y a pas d'électricité, par exemple, quand il fait sombre, c'est impossible pour nous de travailler. Donc je pense que c'est le moment pour l'Afrique de s'ouvrir un peu plus aux investissements afin que nous tous, nous puissions bénéficier d'énergie comme l'électricité et autres, afin de pouvoir travailler de façon paisible. Un tableau que j'ai intitulé Natural Beauty, ça veut dire beauté naturelle en français, et ça représente une femme qui a, on va dire, réussi dans sa vie ou qui est en train de réussir sa vie, comme vous pouvez l'interpréter à travers les nombreux mots enfouis dans ses cheveux, on va dire. I am energy.
Good afternoon and thank you for joining us. It's great to have Javier Curtis there join us as part of the Arts Energy Partnership. Welcome to this digital dialogue looking at the strategies that DFIs are putting in place to protect and rebuild African economies. We actually ran a similar session at AEF 2.0 in June, and it was a fascinating conversation, so I'm looking forward to this one. Without further ado, I'll hand over to our excellent moderator, Etna Trainer.
And Harry, thank you so much. And indeed, it's been Very, very interesting so far, all of the great content that we've seen. And we are now going to deliver even better content, engaging and informative for the next hour. So I'm absolutely delighted to be here with you. And we're going to be looking at what strategies are the development finance institutions putting in place to protect and to rebuild African economies. Let me quickly introduce you to our panel, and we will get right down to business and engage this panel of experts to actually help us to really take a broader look around the environment and see what we need to do, what's happening, the success stories, and indeed where we need to actually move forward. So joining us from the European Investment Bank is the head of corporate lending, Asia, Latin America, and Africa, Caribbean, and the Pacific area. That is Richard Amor. So Richard, thank you for being here. I'm also delighted to be joined by the Chief Development Officer of the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, Andrew Herskowitz. Andrew, thank you so much. Richard Warugongo joining us from the IFC, the International Finance Corporation. He is the Principal Investment Officer. Delighted that you're with us. Thank you. From JP Morgan, the Chief Economist for Africa, Ayomide Mejabi is with us. Nice to have you here. And from the Development Bank of South Africa, the Group Executive Origination and Coverage, Mohan Vivekanandan. Mohan Vivekanandan. Mohan, thank you so much. So we have a great panel there. We really have some expertise amongst us. And if I might start with Richard Amor. Looking at the past few months, particularly since June, when we had talked about the immediate response from the DFIs to COVID-19, are we still in the immediate response phase, or have we actually moved forward? What do you think has been done?
I think it's a super interesting question to kick off, I guess. And I think it's not such a straightforward answer, because I think it really depends actually country by country, sector by sector. So let me give you a couple of examples. It's always easier to explain with a couple of examples. So on the energy side, very particularly, we're focusing a lot on the off-grid and the mini-grid sector. And we're not thus far really seeing so much of a slowdown in the investment strategies of many of these companies. So capital is still moving, it's still being allocated across actually a wide breadth of jurisdictions, and there's quite a significant level of risk appetite that's still out there. But on the other hand, if you're looking at questions of maybe of health, and very specifically, we're very much still in the immediate phase. We're very much still in that rapid response, trying to solve things as quickly as possible. And certainly from what we're looking at in my team, actually very specifically, is a number of different areas that are rapidly moving and changing all the time. So that is diagnostic devices, obviously for COVID, but also for malaria, for tuberculosis. It's actually vaccines. It's trying to support the vaccines R&D to try and find a successful vaccine for COVID. But then it's also, and very importantly, I think for the African continent, it's building the manufacturing capacity on site. So it's making sure that when we get a successful vaccine, it's ready and available and can be manufactured in Africa, ready for the African continent. So I think the question as to whether we're in the immediate response phase or not is not actually as straightforward as one might think. I think the other point that we really have to think about as well is how do we define this idea of a successful immediate response? And I think we as DFIs have sometimes in the past been a little bit guilty of that focus on the number, right? How much money have we provided to this sector? How many disbursements have we made? How much money have we moved into the real economy? Without actually, and I think it's very important in this particular crisis, looking at the real development impact on the ground that we're looking to support. So right now, our focus has been on protection of jobs. So protection of SMEs, making sure SMEs are not going out of business in this very, very difficult time. It's also been actually trying to provide some resilience to infrastructure across many countries. So it's making sure more hospital beds are available, for example. We're doing an awful lot of that across the continent, actually, with the WHO. And it's also keeping schools open, which we've seen across the whole world that the issue of schooling and education has been, it's a really such a vitally important matter throughout this particular crisis. So making sure that simple things like having enough hand sanitizer gel and face masks available on site in education establishments throughout a particular country, and we're doing this in a number of countries in North Africa and West Africa, is super, super important. So it's kind of to come back and answer your question. It's yes, we are still a little bit in the immediate. The of this is we cannot forget throughout the longer term angle, the longer term view that we mustn't forget. And actually, I think that many of us on this panel, it's been at the forefront of our strategies in what we've been looking at over the last 6 months.
And indeed, that's something I definitely want to discuss in a lot more detail, so we'll come back to that. Andrew, I know there's been many challenges in Africa. Of course, there's been challenges around the world in every industry, in every sector. But when you look at the response that was in place, and particularly I think with the DFIs, I mean, certainly I think that response was rapid, it was speedy. How would you judge it in terms of its success?
I think, look, so everyone knows me as being brutally honest. We're not in the immediate response. We responded immediately, but I don't know that we have been able to actually effectively respond immediately. Everyone's been working together. Everyone's wanted to work together. But even when we do something like inject liquidity into the market by working through a financial intermediary to do on lending, I'm questioning, once we make it through our own processes, how long is it actually taking to get money into the hands of the ultimate borrowers at the end of the day? What we have been doing is we've been learning a tremendous amount. And this is the reason that why the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, DFC, just launched a $75 billion strategy, a development strategy that looks at everything under the lens of pandemic response and mitigation. We've learned a tremendous amount over the last few months. We've been working together really, really well, but I think we have to be honest that our responses have been somewhat ad hoc. I mean, we were in triage mode initially for the DFIs. You had to look at your existing portfolio, see how your current clients are doing, figure out which deals need to be restructured. So you're doing that. At the same time, we were looking for opportunities on an ad hoc basis to play some role in the healthcare response. That's the immediate, the real immediate. Is there a need for financing for the manufacturing of ventilators? And we successfully did that on one deal. Now, did we solve the global issue? No, but we realized, all right, we really stretched ourselves in being able to approve deals very, very quickly. And my hope is that the things that we've learned from the pandemic response, we're going to carry forward in terms of collaborating with other DFIs, sharing due diligence, sharing deal flow, and recognizing that we're not in competition with one another. We have to be working together to solve these issues. So DFC's $75 billion strategy, it looks at 6 sectors. Doesn't mean that DFC is not going to do other work, but what's the obvious one? Healthcare. We're going to invest $6 billion in the healthcare sector over the next 5 years, and that's not going to be easy. Food security. Food security is something that everybody saw that we need to be doing more, but not just getting money into the hands of farmers, but we need to be also making sure that we're doing deals that involve higher end manufacturing and creating higher level jobs. Water and sanitation, another key area that's necessary for pandemic response. But what links through all of these things is energy, electricity. You can't build a hospital if it doesn't have electricity. You can't build a health clinic if it doesn't have electricity. So I think that in some ways the pandemic has raised the profile once again of the importance of not just power generation, but energy access. And that's really critical. So in DFC's development strategy, we're not just looking at investing $10 billion in the energy space. We also want to commit to bringing energy access to at least 10 million people, which is a very, very modest goal. But the problem is that DFIs typically have focused heavily on power generation projects and have, smaller off-grid projects supporting solar home system companies. But ultimately, a solar home system is not going to power the equipment that's necessary for a hospital and a health clinic to run. So we really have to focus on distributed power generation in the mini grid space. And our hope with this development strategy is that we're going to be able to nudge our portfolio to work with others to figure out, whether it's through blended finance or otherwise, how we can get that distributed power generation and mini grid space to the point of commercial viability.
And again, I think that is so important. And every time I do a conference that's focusing and looking on Africa, I mean, we are going back to the fact that we have huge numbers in the population that have no access to power, and that's, I mean, no access to energy. And again, it's not about just, you know, getting one home access to energy. It's about making sure that this is something that can actually help the economic viability of that community, of a wider region. So we'll talk more about that, because without a doubt, I think that begins to solve a lot of problems. Richard Warugongo, many people there talking, and Andy just brought it up too as well, you know, about cooperation, about collaboration. And this was one of the key, I think, themes in June, you know, at the Africa Energy Forum too. But have you seen better collaboration and cooperation, you know, in terms of actually the response and people working together? Because, you know, we are all in this together. And I think when it comes to a region like Africa, a lot can be done by maybe sharing resources. What do you see?
Thanks, Edna. So I think, again, just in somewhat in a similar manner to the response that we're getting from Richard Amon on how the situation is impacting different countries in terms of transition. I think let's be honest and real. I think the fact that how things evolved was in the beginning, it's you know, everyone was coming to terms in terms of the health crisis and the immediate actions taken by government in terms of lockdowns, everyone adjusting to, you know, just their own, you know, personal fronts, working from home and all that. There was a lag in terms of just, you know, getting people to do some of the things that they may have wanted to do together. But having said that, the reason I think one needs to recognize that while we have this situation with us now, a lot of what we have been doing and discussing before in terms of how we collaborate did not, you know, the context is not dramatically altered. The context is dramatically altered in terms of the health scenario, but in terms of institutions, in terms of people, in terms of networks, in terms of talking to each other about what are we seeing in our different sector, that has been there, and actually that has intensified. Let me give an example, and also stating that it varies from sector to sector. So if I take the power sector, for example, which is one of those sectors that has been impacted in a number of our markets, a lot of us, especially on the private sector side of this, are supporters of sponsors and projects in projects predominantly in the generation space, but in a number of other areas. Now, as these sectors were getting hit, as some of the, in particular country contexts, as some of, say, for example, utilities started to issue force majeure notices, so on and so forth, what happened? You know, people started to get together and talk to each other, right? You're either talking to your sponsor has a number of, not just one party, but a number of DFIs that may have provided financing to a particular project. It comes down to the people, to the institutions. You start talking and say, what's going on? What can we do? How can we help? Now, we're more on the private sector side, but there are also conversations going on the public sector focus side. You know, a number of governments, just given the situation that they were in, started to take certain rapid decisions, some of which were helpful, but some of which had the risk of long-term damage, right? In terms of tariffs, decisions taken in the sector. So again, that required some sort of discussion, collaboration, policy dialogue with governments, with institutional actors, among development partners, to make sure that while we were addressing the immediate issues, we were not causing long-term, irretractable damage. So in short, I think there has been collaboration, and that collaboration doesn't necessarily mean that we have all signed joint facilities and put money into new projects. To be honest, most of it has been. A lot of it has been dialogue. But I think as we get into the next phase of things, we're going to see more collaboration in SME financing, in certain other projects we work on together as we move the agenda forward.
Thank you. And indeed, that cooperation, yes, it's not going to all happen uniformly. We have to really look around and see what needs to be done and who needs to do it quicker. Ayomide, when we look at, obviously everybody had longer term plans, but a lot of plans have been, upturned and people had to react quicker. When we look at the investment that maybe was in place, what has been, I suppose, shifted, or what needed to leapfrog to actually take care of the issue at the moment in terms of what was needed this year? And is there any danger that, major plans have been perhaps, derailed because of the absolute urgency of making sure the investment was where it was needed, to handle this crisis in Africa.
Yeah, thanks, Etna. I mean, from a private sector perspective, at the start of the pandemic, around April, May, there was a lot of concern that the most vulnerable countries will be left behind, and the G20 mobilized and asking, with the help of the World Bank, IMF, asking for some level of burden sharing as it relates to the financial market. So there was clearly a liquidity challenge, and there were calls for some form of grace periods, extending terms, deferring some debt service on the external side. In addition to that, there was some finger pointing, to be fair, at the private sector, that the private sector was unwilling to burden share with the official sector. And to put that into perspective, I think it's worth thinking about where we are coming from. A lot of the countries in Africa, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, had their first debt bond issuance less than 10 years ago. And since then, we've had 11 debut bond issuers since 2008 up until today. And many of these countries have worked really hard to gain market access for themselves. The private sector's response around May, June, certainly around the time of this conference, was that we shouldn't have a one-size-fits-all remedy. There should be more of a nuanced way to preserve market access for the countries that don't really have to lose it, and also to then work with some of the countries that needed it. Since June, what has actually happened is not many countries needed to be bailed out by the private sector. Markets were short initially, yields went higher, but actually since we've had more in North Africa, but Egypt has come to the market, has issued a $5 billion bond. The Nigerian government hasn't issued a bond, but actually corporates in Nigeria, banks have issued bonds in the international market. So clearly there's been an opening of the private markets to African and frontier markets. I think going forward, what the focus will turn toward is solvency. I think we've had liquidity, and it's been clear that the private sector didn't have to short markets to these countries. Maybe the only example there will be Zambia, but the problems there were before COVID. I think going forward, there's going to be a lot of scrutiny on solvency and debt transparency, and that's how capital from the private sector, at least, will be distributed within Africa.
Thank you. When we look, Mohan, on South Africa particularly, and again the swift action that needed to be taken immediately, and again, looking, are we still in immediate response, or have we moved away from that, and what is in place to make sure that recovery actually in place? I think that's a question everyone around the world is grappling with, and even at the G20 conference I was doing earlier this week, I mean, this is where people are still very concerned. We almost haven't got out of there, and if we don't build that back well, it's going to be, growth is a long way away. How are things looking in South Africa?
Look, I mean, the reality is, the economic situation is quite dire. Even before COVID, the country was in a recession driven by a number of factors, but including, for instance, constraints in the energy sector. And obviously, with the onset of COVID, we were quite affected. At one point, we were number 5 in the world in terms of number of cases. And there was quite a strict lockdown that had been put in place, which has definitely impacted the economy. Over 2 million jobs have been lost, a very significant drop in GDP. Now, in terms of what the country has done, there has been, from the Reserve Bank side, an injection of liquidity. From ourselves as the leading DFI around the infrastructure sector in South Africa, what we've done is we've partnered with the government in order to focus on how do we utilize infrastructure and infrastructure investment, in the words of the president, as a flywheel to grow the economy. And we think there are significant opportunities to do that. There's a significant private sector in South Africa, including long-term investors who really want to come off the sidelines and be able to invest in the sector, but haven't always had access to bankable projects. So really our goal has been working with an office in the presidency called Infrastructure South Africa, the DBSA has been allocated the setup of an infrastructure fund. And really together, what we're trying to do is to identify a number of projects, and projects have been identified. And we're looking on a sector by sector basis to try and unlock programs for investment. This is AEF, so there's a big focus on energy, and the energy sector is one where now, the Minister for Energy has announced a program to finally reopen another round of investments, which is going to, target at least 12 gigawatts of energy, 6 gigawatts in a significant amount, and we're really happy about that. And as I'm sure there's a lot of international investors, both as equity and on the debt side as well, who are quite keen to take part in that program as an example.
Thank you so much. Andrew, I want to come back to you on talking about that new U.S. development fund and the $10 billion that you have available for, energy access, and that because energy access, I think, is at the very heart of anything else happening. Talk to me a little bit more, because, there is a sense of urgency here, and, even looking ahead to the UN, Sustainable Development Goals, we have been talking about this issue for a long time. What can that fund do to hopefully not have us discussing the same problem in 5 years' time?
So let me clarify. We have $10 billion as a goal for investment in the energy sector. That's upstream, downstream, power generation, everything. We've set, that's just our input. This is what DFIs we've always done. We have these inputs of how much money we're going to invest. What's different is we're now, for each sector, coming up with the output of what we want to see. It's not necessarily a direct correlation between the input and the output. We should be able to achieve 10 million people getting access to electricity with a fraction of that amount of investment. And that's really the floor. I mean, we have up to $60 billion ceiling at DFC. So if there are more deals than $10 billion, we could do more. But what we need to do is we need to figure out how to get mini grids in the sector to the point of commercial viability. And all of us, we focus so heavily on the big power generation projects, and they're important. We have to focus more on the cross-border transmission. There's nothing better than power trading, and even each country producing its own power. It's not the most efficient way, so we have to really figure that out. We have to figure out how to strengthen the utilities. So part of our increased electrical connections could be through support that we provide to utilities. We have to figure out how to improve distribution. And will we get more creative and get into the space of providing private financing for distribution? It's a real challenge. We need some projects. We need to figure out how to do this. Just as, look, DFC shared this story yesterday. The way that DFIs think is very different than the way that development institutions like USAID think. Everyone's concerned about whether or not their project's going to make money. When they lose money, they become very ashamed of that. And so the example that I'll give is DFC, or OPIC, lost a lot of money investing in some of the early Chilean solar projects. And I was talking with one of our financial people, and I explained, I said, look, even if we lost $50 or $100 million, that's great from a development standpoint, because we hadn't been, remember, we are a public institution. We're not a commercial bank. So first of all, to have us lose $50 or $100 million, if this had been grant funded by USAID or someone else, we'd have lost $1 billion, or wouldn't have lost it. We would have given away $1 billion. But what we did by investing in these projects is we helped create the market that allows countries like South Africa, like Zambia, and others achieve the low solar prices that they're getting right now. And if we hadn't done that, the market never would have developed. And that's what DFIs need to be doing. We need to be the first ones to market. Like the idiot who was the first guy who bought a plasma TV for $3,000, that's our job. We have to be that idiot, okay? Because the next person can get one, now you buy it for $100. But that's our role. We've got to be the first ones to market. And it's a lot better to do that. Otherwise, the market's never going to develop. This is part of my role at DFC. Most people don't agree with me, right? I would keep explaining that you've got the USAIDs of the world that are giving money away, grant money that's never given. Then you've got commercial banks over here. The problem is that development finance institutions are playing too close to the commercial banks. We need to be somewhere in the middle. And I'm not saying that we should enter into any project knowing that we're going to lose money, but we do need to take a lot more risk and know that it's okay to lose money, because the difference between losing money, so one way we would describe as Power Africa. Okay, we helped over 120 projects reach financial close. And I used to always say, but the US government only spent about $500 million helping that 120 projects that are worth over $20 billion reach financial close. And everyone applauded. Great, that's incredible leverage. $500 million got you $20 billion a project. But if a development finance institution says, we lost $500 million on this $20 billion portfolio, everyone's like ashamed and wants to go hide somewhere. And you got to change the culture in the way that we think about these things, because we are public institutions, and this is why we exist. We have to bridge these market imperfections and create the future market.
Iomida, talk to me when we look at JP Morgan. That's very much a commercial organization. Obviously, you have the development finance institution in place since the beginning of this year here. But I mean, when you're looking at projects and you're looking at the risk involved, what's uppermost on your mind?
I mean, like, as Andrew was talking there, we are the idiots that decided to not only be a commercial bank and try to dip our hands in the development finance space. I think, we've tackled, and just happened that COVID happened this year. Clearly, the plans to start the DFI have been in the works, but we've actually tackled COVID on two fronts. One, we've had a long-standing sovereign advisory team, which I think has been quite successful in advising both the countries, but also corporates in emerging markets and in Africa specifically in the last 6 months on how do markets think, what do they need to do in order to still have access to private capital. So that's on the one hand. On the second front is the DFI. So the DFI started in January, and the aim there was basically to take the well-known standard UN SDG framework and try to apply it to commercial banking, investment banking, where we try to identify through the pipeline, projects that will be suitable for call it ESG development finance projects. And it's early days. It's worked, I would say, not yet in Africa. We've recently been appointed global development finance agents for a utility firm in Georgia and also in Mongolia for the sovereign. So clearly frontier markets, and the aim is to continue to do that, and eventually to be able to announce a deal. And there are talks in the pipeline, be able to announce a deal in Africa. Going forward, the hope is that there will be a more open collaboration and communication line with long-standing DFIs in order to share things like pipelines, in order to help advise on how to provide partial guarantees for some of these countries to reduce the cost of borrowing and also open them to more capital.
Richard Amor, if I can bring you in here, talking about risk, should DFIs be actually maybe taking more risk and doing more perhaps to crowd capital into higher risk markets where we're not able to get the private finance, that's maybe scarce and they're not as eager to do it? What can DFIs do in that scenario?
Oh, no, it's an excellent question, and I think it's actually just coming back a little bit to what was said before with Andrew when he was talking about what we need to be at the vanguard of this exercise, and I think there's a couple of things that we can do here. Is we can find what works and find the best practices around the world, and we have this experience with this this global presence that many of us have, and to try and pick and choose those successful models to see if they can be applicable elsewhere. So, actually on the specific issue that Andrew was talking about on trying to get private capital into the distribution network of electricity for electricity, for example, is we're looking at some really interesting models that have taken place in Indian cities in the last 4 or 5 years, which is a kind of a quasi PPP model, and looking to see, working with risk capital that might be available from the European Commission or from various foundations or from others, to see if we can try and mobilize those different types of structures on the African continent. And maybe this is something that Andrew and we should have a talk about after this session, to make sure that we can team up and properly collaborate on it, on this thing. But to come back to your question, Etna, what can we do and how do we engage? I think where we have to go is we have to go into those very difficult areas. And I think from a risk perspective, what we almost have to be looking at are those quasi-bankable, pre-bankable structures, and those companies and those startups and those SMEs that are searching for capital. So we at the EIB, we've done one interesting thing over the last 4 years, very specifically to deal with this question in sub-Saharan Africa. So we set up what we called was the impact finance envelope, which is a small envelope. It's 800 million euros. It's very much targeted at first-time fund managers who are setting up investment funds for new businesses and SMEs across the continent. It's also looking at projects and companies that are simply unable to find capital elsewhere on a commercial basis. And we would be coming in and providing first loss pieces, providing mezz debt, providing different types of structures that are crowding in and bringing in our colleagues in the private sector who are still looking for that little bit of extra comfort in these sectors or in these regions. The other really interesting point that we should be looking at as DFIs and IFIs in this area is how do we engage with those parts of the financial world that have been found a little bit difficult to invest in Africa. So one of the things that we're also doing is we're working with a couple of the regional development banks at supporting their bond issuances. So this is green bonds, but this is also SDG themed bonds. So what we would do is we come in, we provide technical assistance to help these institutions in their reporting and getting themselves set up for these bond issues, because many of them have never issued before. But we also act as anchor cornerstone investors. And that messaging that Andrew was talking about before is also very key here. Because when these banks are going to market, they're going to market saying, EIB, they will take up to 20, 25, 30% of this bond issuance. They are there. We have blessed it. We are comfortable with the institution that is doing the issuing of these bonds. And that acts as a mobilizing factor. We would like to take less. So we would be very happy if we come along and the bond issuance comes along and we only end up with 5 or 10% of the issuance, because we've acted as a catalyst and provided that security and that comfort for other takers of this paper. So it's these types of maybe slightly different structures where we push the envelope, whether it's on sectors or whether it's on risk appetite, that we can take this, we can do this, and we need to do this. But maybe we can talk a little bit as well. We do better when we team up. So we can all be very cynical about this, and we are different actors with different stakeholders, and we all have our targets and we all have everything that we have. What certainly we found, and in particular during this COVID period, is that we've been much more impactful when we've worked together on a particular project or on a particular solution. Just to give you one example
I think it's very
please
important.
Go on. Yeah.
And I think it's something that, everybody will have something to say. Mohan, just carrying on from what Richard was talking about there in terms of that risk appetite and the need. And again, I would say there's no idiots out here. I think you're all the pioneers of what has to be done. And I think what you do, is very commendable. And I think that you're so right. I mean, somebody has to start this, and we've seen time and time again where others will follow. But if you guys are not there, then in many ways there's not much hope. But talk to me, Mohan, about that sort of appetite for risk. And you talk about money needing bankable projects. What's a good bankable project right now, and why don't we have enough?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, just a comment around the risk. I think your balance sheet determines the level of risk you can take. So if Andrew's case, he's able to go to USAID and get a few $1 billion and throw that money around, fantastic. We unfortunately don't have that ability. Similarly, Richard, that the EU probably writes them a check for a few €100 billion all the time. They're all AAA rated entities. Fantastic. Unfortunately, those of us who are on the African continent, we're owned by African nations. And so, in our case, for instance, our rating's now been downgraded to BA1. It's sub-investment grade. So it's quite challenging, and we really need to be careful about how we deploy our capital so that it's not done in a foolish manner. So one of the things we've done is to say there are ways you can mitigate risk in the investments that you make, even when you're supporting private sector. And if you can do those things, then the chances, for instance, of your NPLs are going to be much lower. And that is to really figure out, rather than, for instance, backing a private hospital or a private student housing accommodation that's completely exposed to market risk, how do you build in some sort of an offtake from the provincial government in the health sector, or, for instance, a university, so that they're not completely, guaranteeing that structure, but there's a little bit of an offtake that's being built in, which takes away an element of the market risk, as an example. And so it's that kind of a program approach that we're looking in each of the different infrastructure sectors in South Africa in order to minimize risk, which then allows the private sector and deploy more capital. But at the same time, taking a portion of that risk as well. So that's one of the elements that we've been doing around the risk mitigation side. Moving on then to your question about the bankable projects, what we've realized is, yes, there is a lack of bankable projects, but it's not necessarily the case that the private sector even is not willing to invest in funding the bankable feasibility studies if they know how those projects are going to be accepted through a procurement process. I mean, coming back, for instance, to the South African IPP program, none of those projects have been funded in terms of the feasibility work by a government entity or ourselves. All of that's been funded by the private sector. They were willing to do it because, one, there was a long-term resource plan in place in the country of what was the energy demand and the energy supply. And then there were a number of rounds that were quite transparent in terms of the criteria that were going to be used for procuring those projects. So in those cases, the private sector was willing to make those investments. Now, when that regulatory uncertainty exists, it's going to be a lot more difficult for private investors to even invest in the feasibility. And even for a DFI, it may not make sense to fund feasibility studies if you don't know where that feasibility study is going to go. And I mean, there was a recent survey by an organization called the African Infrastructure Delivery Agency. It's a group of private investors and some DFIs, and they were looking at what are some of the main reasons why the private sector is not investing in infrastructure projects on the continent. And if I look at the reasons, one of them is financially unstable off-takers. Another is growing, country and political risk. And the third one is increased uncertainty around the regulatory environment. So, the countries really need to invest in their regulatory environment to provide more certainty, which will then allow the private sector to invest in a number of these sectors.
Yes, and I think regulatory environment is an issue too that we've seen over the years. It's not going away, and we don't have that sort of uniform sense of confidence, I think, in every country. So obviously the ones that have clearer, more transparent regulatory environments are going to get more money. But Richard Warugongo, if I can bring you in here, and when we look at the fact that there is money around for bankable projects and all of that stuff, this is all very good. But recently, there's been a few reports just stressing the fact that there's been an unsustainable accumulation of public debt in Africa, to the point where average in sub-Saharan Africa it's increased from 29.6% to 53, more than 50% of GDP, like in over a year. That's an awful lot of debt to be carrying. What can the countries do, or what can, particularly what can the DFIs actually help to maybe lessen that burden? Or is it their role?
That's a pretty interesting question, and to some degree a sensitive one, to be honest. Because then you could quickly get into the question of if you go back 10 years and looked at the public debt profile of these countries, or if you go back earlier, and I'm sure your media can speak to this more, when people start to talk about the point at which there was a HIPIC program and for lack of a better word, clean up on the public debt side, and then what has happened since? Why have countries, for example, like Zambia, moved from that point to the point where they are now? So look, I mean, it's a very involved question. It varies from country to country. What's not in doubt is that, from a political front, as people come in and are voted to offices, the increasingly the dialogue that goes on is one where they say, look, I'm going to do this, that, and the other. And this, that, and the other, in most cases, involves mega infrastructure projects. We're getting to the point where sometimes it's beggar thy neighbor, right? I've got this particular, asset, let's say a railway, that looks and feels a certain manner, and then, the other country wants the same. And what's happening in that process is that, and especially before this debt build-up, is, countries felt they had the fiscal space. In my own view, I think what got lost is increasingly the selectivity, the gatekeeping. Instead of people paying more attention in terms of, let's just look at where we're spending this money, especially on the public sector side, how we are selecting the projects, how sustainable are they. I think there was a lot more willingness to commit and get things built. But I think given where we are now, and there's no denying in a number of our markets, the level of public debt is high and fiscal sustainability issues have popped up, people are stepping back and starting to ask themselves, where do we go from here? And so, look, it's two things. It's a risk and it's an opportunity. It's a risk because, we have to, on top of that, we have COVID, which is putting on more stress in terms of macro and public sector spending and debt. But we have to go through this, right? And all countries are having the conversations, whether it's South Africa, whether it's Kenya, whether it's Zambia, in different parts of the paradigm, they're having the conversation. But I think the way we get out of this is not just going to be adding more debt. Of course, in the short term, there has to be, because the public sector has to pick up slack on the macro and budget side, given COVID. But getting out of this, and none of us knows exactly when this will end, but let's even say by 2022, 2023, there isn't fiscal space to continue spending and committing the same way, which is where you bring in the likes of us and others who hopefully are more focused in investing on the private side. And I think there are solutions that are there. And the question we are tackling, why aren't there enough pipeline of bankable projects? Part of it is because from a dialogue perspective, the political economy means that governments don't want to let go of some of those sectors, right? For whatever it means. But hopefully over time, as people start to look at how do you rebalance this economy? Where can we get more capital to go into these sectors, airports and other things, without us borrowing and then deploying on an EPC basis? We'll hopefully start to see more willingness to engage the private sector. And there's no shortage of capital. We just need proper dialogue on the policy side, proper procurement processes. Mohan, I also like your example about the IRP in South Africa and people having sight. And then execution in terms of the actual transactions. We need transparent mechanisms, good advice. And a number of the institutions here have the capability to support governments in doing that. We're doing quite a bit of that and are willing to do more. We call it upstream, we call it advisory. And to the extent it's well received, we'll continue to do more. I think that's where more of the effort is needed. It's less on the money is needed, but increasingly, as we say, there's more money than opportunities. Thanks, Esma.
And indeed, Ayomeda, come in on that, since you said that you would have something to say on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think, to be clear, it's not an African problem alone, right? When you look at the change in debt to GDP, it's the same change that you have in Southeast Asia, in Latin America. There's been a big move higher in debt, but that's also because there's been a lot of external debt, right? So because currencies have come under pressure this year, that number mechanically moves higher. So what is the solution going forward? I think it's twofold. One is you need to solve over reliance on external debt. I mean, there needs to be there needs to be an improvement in domestic markets and an ability for government and the private sector in Africa to solve how to develop their market. And I feel that that's where DFIs can help. There's been some efforts by regional banks. I know the African Development Bank is working with some of the larger African countries on this, but I think that needs to move even further out into the smaller countries. And I do think that there's a role for the private sector to play. For instance, JP Morgan has a suite of indices where it's probably one of the largest indices that active portfolio investors follow, emerging market bond indices. And I would say 10 years ago, many of those indices never included partially guaranteed bonds, never included sustainable development bonds, ESG bonds. That's changing. 3 weeks ago, the team announced that we are going to start looking at, for instance, the Ghana 30s that was partially guaranteed by the World Bank. What that does is that it opens the bonds up to a whole new set of investors, which further reduces the cost of borrowing. I think that's one way that the private sector or banks can help. But second has to be by the African countries ourselves, right? I'm in London, but I'm an African as well. There needs to be more transparency. There's been a lot of new investment from China hasn't been as transparent as usual. I think that needs to change.
Indeed, and talking about that transparency, Richard Amor, I want to bring you in on that, and Andrew, I see you were agreeing on that too. But the World Bank itself is saying that some of the development banks are actually worsening the public debt crisis in poor countries. But on that level of transparency as well, Richard, I mean, what can we do?
No, yeah, I'll be brief because I think you explained it extremely well. I mean, I think from our side, we would make the argument that right now, in particular in a crisis situation, the level of disbursements that are coming out to the worst hit countries and those countries who are in difficulty far exceeds the regular repayments that these countries have to us right now. So as an immediate response perspective, we believe it continues to be the right thing to do. I think in the longer term, though, the issue of transparency is absolutely key because for us, but also for the private sector, as you've rightly said, is that without that certainty and comfort that we understand the debt situation of a particular country, it makes it exceedingly difficult for anybody to make an investment in that country at any time. And in particular, the other part about this is when we come to a crunch and a difficult time right now, we need to understand the debt dynamics, so we can find a viable and useful solution that will allow our counterparts and many of these countries to get back to the markets as soon as possible. And I will finish just with one last point on this is what's been very interesting from our side is that actually the number of countries who have come to us asking for these kinds of debt holidays and moratoriums on debt repayments are exceedingly low, are very, very small because of the adverse impact they believe that might have with regard to the financial markets. So they want to take the responsibility and to keep the relationship going and to keep whole. But so we're at a very interesting crunch point time on that particular issue right now. Thanks.
But also, I suppose too, yes, it's part of the fact that they will, be downgraded as well if they are looking to add that, Richard. So I want to bring Andrew in on this because I think this is a topic that many of you want to talk about. And two of the words that have been in the title of what we're talking about too was to protect and to rebuild African economies. So, while you are the frontier people out there, they're still building debt every day in Africa.
Yeah. There's so many good points made, and there's one elephant in the room that we didn't talk about. Mohan made great points as to what are preventing projects from being bankable. The biggest other, so I always talk about lack of predictability, which is sort of the uncertain regulatory environment. It's not even just uncertain, it's the constantly changing regulatory environment. The other one's currency. And currency is the biggest issue. Currency mismatches, lack of availability of foreign currency for repatriation, huge impediment. I'm going to go back though to the point about DFIs and what our interests and our roles are. Mohan made a good point when I was, very cavalierly talking about how it's not important we shouldn't emphasize making money so much. Very different for DBSA, which is a regional institution. It goes towards sort of long-term sustainability and building these strong institutions. The US, the European institutions that are doing development finance, we were created for the point of doing development. That's why we exist, right? And we're supposed to be losing some money, giving some money away. We're supposed to be giving less of money away, yet using fewer of our taxpayer resources by doing financing than we would if we were just giving grants. But no country has been as generous as the United States. Major distinction between China and the United States. I tell people this all the time, and I'm not even being political. It's a fact. Belt and Road was not designed to help the African people or the people in the developing world. It was designed to help China. And China, they can build a road, and they might lose some money on that road, but hey, let's go ahead. I'm going to lend you that money. Maybe we'll get paid back, maybe we won't, but it's better than just paying for it ourselves. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I want your natural resources, and I want to have a clear trade route, okay? So let's not fool ourselves. The US and the Europeans, I assume the same. When we're doing this work, we want to see the outputs. We want to see the development of the African continent. In fact, when I was running Power Africa, when I would go brief members of Congress on both sides of the political aisle, I had a senator say to me, "Don't tell me about how many jobs this is going to create in my state. That's not why I'm doing this. We're doing this because this is what the US does. We care about development. We would like to create strong trade linkages, which is why the US government has Prosper Africa. We want to increase two-way trade. But we're doing this because we care about the development of the continent. And this is the reason why we need to take more risk. We need to make sure that institutions like DBSA are strong. Now, Mohan, I wish I could get billions of dollars from USAID. I can't. I struggle to get a few million out of USAID, but that's part of my role, trying to figure out how to twist their arms and show how it's in their interest. I keep telling USAID, stop thinking about how you're helping out DFC. You need to understand that DFC is USAID's bank, and it's much better for a USAID mission with a $20 million budget rather than spending all that money, on a contractor who's going to be running around the country giving advice on the sector. You could turn that money to basically to seed the funding that we need for a $50 million or $100 million loan, for whether it's for getting money out through a financial intermediary to MFIs, or if it's building infrastructure. But we can leverage that, and that's the thinking that needs to change. We need to do better coordination internally within our own institutions to make sure that people see the benefit of using that money so that we can get more lending out to people and create the market that ultimately will help lift countries out of poverty and create the two-way trade.
Andrew, just continuing on that, you have a big election coming up, and everybody knows about it. Will DFC continue to be well-funded no matter who's in power?
DFC and Power Africa are the two things that had 100% bipartisan support. Every member of Congress voted to support both of these things. Power Africa is one of the few initiatives that continued from the Obama administration into the Trump administration. So I don't think anybody needs to worry about the commitment to Africa. And in fact, we learned from Power Africa to create Prosper Africa. And so we're trying to use that model to expand it to other sectors, but also create those opportunities for the two-way trade so that we can benefit U.S. companies, because we do have to benefit U.S. companies. And ultimately, at the end of the day, is the U.S. taxpayer. And like everyone else in the world, our economy is suffering. We've got our own issues that we need to deal with internally, and we need to make sure that people have jobs, but we need to make sure that these are two-way relationships.
Long may it continue, indeed. We've only got about 6 minutes left, and there's so many areas we haven't talked about. But before we go, and I have 5 of you on the panel, so I want to make sure you get at least a minute each to really talk to us about when we look at, I guess, the longer term in terms of what has to be done. It's all fine to be looking now at what we're doing and what's working, but how do we look at the long-term strategies? Mohan, perhaps if I can maybe start with you, in terms of where do we go from here?
Yeah, I think the one point that I wanted to add on was that, it's very critical that we as African institutions continue to build ourselves and build our partner institutions, because I think it's absolutely critical that those institutions exist in the countries to help really drive governance, to really make sure that the money that is being spent wisely and focused on the right sets of things. So one of our focus areas has been to work with other smaller national development banks in the SADC region, which is Southern African Development Community, and in East Africa as well. And so that when we make investments, let's say in a Mozambique, in a Botswana, in Tanzania, in Angola, we do it with a local development bank as well. Even if they don't have the balance sheet, they've got the local knowledge and access to the critical projects. And I think that element of building local institutions is very critical. And I hope, the DFC, EIB, IFC, and the entities really help drive that element as they move forward.
Richard Warugunga, when we look at, again, what happens, what do we do in terms of those long-term strategies? I think we've all talked about what's going on at the moment, but what do you think you can actually put in place to make sure that we're in this for the long term and that we're not talking about this in another 5 years,
So look, now I think the way I'm going to answer this is pick on 3 themes that I think are were already existing, but will get accelerated and are critical in terms of how we move the agenda forward in Africa. One of them is digital. The future is digital. And, we can't afford to be left behind from a digital perspective. Africa is a young continent, lots of creatives. In the city that I am in, Nairobi, lots of ideas flowing. They need to get supported. We need to keep moving that agenda forward and leapfrog. The other one is urbanization, right? I may complain about congestion in Dar es Salaam, in Nairobi, in Kampala, in Lagos, wherever I go, but also that just is the pains of these places, as people come together. And I mean, Africa is not as urbanized other than South Africa, which I guess is in the 60%. I mean, if you come to most of East Africa, it's in the 30%, but that's growing, and that's going to provide opportunities and challenges. And finally, I would like to talk about regional integration, right? Both existing ones, like the one Mohan is speaking about, SADC, East African Community, COMESA, ECOWAS and all that, but also in terms of trade, the whole push to have, Africa continent wide free trade area, which is not going to be easy. It's going to be a multi-year effort, but we have to move forward. So that's where I see the hope. Thank you.
Andrew, when we look at the investment areas, where do you see, the must invest at the moment? Or have you seen that shift over the last few years? And again, are you focusing different funds to different sectors?
The must invest are in the least developed countries. I felt very guilty after, towards the end of my term in Power Africa, where I was sort of sending out my final letter to everyone. And I said, all right, we can continue to do projects in South Africa and Kenya and markets that know how to do this, Rwanda, but we really need to focus in the Burundis and the Burkinas and other countries where they really need the assistance from others. The South Africans, they know how to run a tendering process. The Kenyans, they know how to do that. And we'll still support those projects, but we really need to focus, particularly with public sector efforts, in some of those less mature markets, which others view as frontier markets. But one of the great things about DFC is we no longer have this U.S. nexus requirement. We no longer have to have an American company involved in the project. So one of my last trips was Madagascar, and Madagascar, like a lot of countries, there are local businesses, sometimes family-owned businesses that are huge and have been operational for 50 or 100 years. It's a huge opportunity for DFC now to work with them. And not only does it benefit the local company by getting access to the good financing from DFC, it'll open up some trade opportunities for US as well. So we have to focus, all of us have to focus more heavily in the low income and the lower middle income countries. In fact, as part of our strategy, we're committing to doing at least 300 projects in low income and lower middle income countries or at least about 60% of our portfolio.
Ayomide, what can JP Morgan do in the long terms? What are you looking at?
Well, clearly, JP Morgan, we've started the DFI. I think that can only get better. And I was speaking to the head of the DFI, and there's intentions to improve access in Africa. Second thing JP Morgan is doing, and would do a lot more, is to focus on two parts: to leverage the huge amount of capital that's looking to allocate itself to sustainable investment, and to help African issuers both on the sovereign, subnational, and on the corporate side. Like I mentioned earlier, we are including sustainability covenants in our indices. I think that can only improve the pool of capital. And then second is to help African countries harness domestic savings. I talked about local markets. A lot of the pension funds are having to buy government securities in Africa. I think that there's room for that to be leveraged and to become more formal. So and that's something that JP Morgan has been doing and will continue to do by opening more offices. Historically, it's only been in South Africa, but now we've opened a new office in Lagos, and that's going to get better. Thank you.
There are, so many challenges, but again, so many opportunities there. Richard Amor, I'm giving you the last word on this in terms of longer term strategies. What can we do?
Well, for me, I'm incredibly optimistic, actually, despite this crisis that we're in right now. Africa is the youngest continent, the fastest urbanizing, is going to have this growing middle class. That's new consumption, that's new goods, that's new markets for internet access, for energy, that's opportunities. And I think for me, the big change is this: we should be all viewing the continent as a continent of opportunity. So I'd like to end it there, right? We should be extremely optimistic, all of us, for doing business across the continent. And I think it's a really, really bright future.
Well, indeed, and I hope that, I think around the world, everybody is hoping that the impact of COVID-19 will actually move by the end of the year and, not linger too long, because I think it's done so much damage to the world. And the big danger, of course, that rich and poor divide could get worse. I think something that's on everybody's mind. But as you say, it is a continent on the move. And, we're looking at, even as Richard was saying there, it's about technology, it's about digitalization, and a lot of the younger population too demanding it, and they know how to use it. And it's a very, very different time. You're so right. But hopefully the role of the development finance institutions will grow and prosper, and will actually help the country grow and prosper, all of the countries. The continent is what I mean to say there. So I really want to thank you, Richard, Andrew, Richard again, Richard A and Richard W I have here, Ayomide and Mohan. Thank you all so much for your great contribution. This is a topic we could have done at least 2 hours on. And to my dear audience, we didn't have time to even get to any of your questions. So please forgive me on that. But we will continue these conversations, right through for many more weeks to come. AEF, be sure and sign in, have a look at what we're doing. There will be video recorded on demand, of course, that you can play back and really listen to what everybody has to say, look at their solutions, and look at their ideas and see what you think about it. But one thing for sure, do stay in touch. We'll be here for the long term, and indeed all of the great efforts from the pioneers here, many of the big DFIs in place, and the great work that you're doing, and the great work, I think, by each and every one of you. The passion and the energy and the effort that I think you personally put in and bring to the table too is very important. So I want to thank you all on behalf of AEF for being with us, and for the work you do. Continue to do it, and we'll finish on those words of Richard Amor too, that we look to a bright future. So thank you all so much, and stay in touch with AEF, and we'll keep in touch with you. Thank you.
I am really very proud of the efforts that we are making, and all the bank is highly committed and motivated to make this a reality.
FinFund is a development financier and impact investor with the mission to build a better world by investing in sustainable and viable businesses in developing countries. With annual investments totaling over 250 million euros in Africa and across Asia and Latin America, we provide equity, long-term investment loans and mezzanine financing. Profitable and responsible businesses are vital to development. They provide employment and enable people to earn a living and rise from poverty. And they have an important role to play in tackling climate change. Many of our projects help create new ways for consumers to access energy supply and services. But the way in which developing countries meet their rapidly growing energy needs will be critical to curbing climate change. Renewable energy is one of FinFund's focus areas. We invest in companies which generate cleaner, cheaper, and more reliable energy than existing alternatives, including wind, solar, hydro, and bioenergy, as well as geothermal, C&I solutions, and e-mobility. Energy is a key sector for FinFund, covering 1/4 of our total portfolio, and for which we have a dedicated investment team. Especially renewable energy contributes not only to development goals, but also to international targets on climate change mitigation and adaptation. FinFund, professional impact investing in developing countries.